Hello and welcome to this episode of Worldwise. My name is Isaac Stonefish. I'm an associate editor at Foreign Policy Magazine here in DC, and I'm very honored to be talking to Dr. Cheng Li, a senior fellow at Brookings Institution and an expert on elite Chinese politics. Dr. Li, I'd love to start off today with asking you about the transition that just happened in China from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping and his new colleagues on the standing committee. First, can you explain if we should expect to see anything different with China's policies now that Xi Jinping is in power?
Well, China is a paradox of hope and fear, and a major change in China is also a paradox of hope and fear. And with the new leadership, we do hope that they will bring China to the next phase of China's development, and will resolve some of the economic, social, and political problems, and also to improve China's foreign relations, especially with neighboring countries, with the United States and other countries. Now, at the same time, that people are also concerned whether the new leadership will also deal with the urgency or the necessity for political reform. So this is a question very much in people's mind. And the new group, the new team under Xi Jinping, they are quite capable in terms of economic and financial reforms. And many of them had decades of experience and have a good reputation, especially like Xi Jinping and also former Vice Premier Wang Qishan. They all have that reputation in the economic reform. But the question is, nowadays, some of the economic reform require a serious political change, and otherwise the political bottleneck will undermine or prevent real economic development.
So everyone talks about this idea of reform. China needs to reform, it needs economic reform, it needs political reform. What do you think reform means to Xi Jinping, and what do you think the chances are that he will institute any sort of political reform that will actually fundamentally change the way China is?
Well, you're absolutely right. The word of reform is so frequently used and sometimes lost its original meaning. Sometimes economic reformers could be political conservative. Sometimes political reformers could be economic conservative. This is not uniquely Chinese, but certainly in the Chinese politics, you see that evidence. Now, let me also mention that China is a one-party state. The Chinese Communist Party monopolized power, but does not necessarily mean that the Chinese leadership is a monolithic group with leaders who have the same background, views, ideas, ideologies. Actually, they're quite different. And different in terms of social economic background and the way they move to the leadership position and the policy preferences, and to a certain extent also ideologies, actually. Now, usually we divide the Chinese politics in a very simple way, because of course in reality it's probably more complicated, is that what I call one party, two factions, or one party, two coalitions. Now, one group is led by Jiang Zemin, and initially was founded in early 1990s when Jiang Zemin moved to Beijing after 1989 Tiananmen. And this is what we can call Jiang's camp. Early on, the core group was Shanghai Mafia or Shanghai Gang. And now recently that the more leaders of this camp come from what we call princelings. And princelings meaning that the leaders come from a very prominent family background. Their fathers or father-in-laws are revolutionary veterans or other senior ranking leaders. People like Xi Jinping, Wang Qishan, and Yu Zhengzhen, they're all in the Power Bureau Standing Committee, belong to that camp.
Dr. Li, let me just make sure that everyone can follow this. So what you're saying is that in the early 90s, when Jiang Zemin became president of China, when he took power, he brought up a group of people that kind of, he created his own faction, and from this were people that he knew in Shanghai and also princelings. Do we know why So why did Zhang build his camp this way?
Well, first of all, when he moved to Beijing in 1989, he was quite alone. He was an 11-hour choice, and his leadership skill will need to be tested. He did not have his own power base. So he brought with him Zheng Qinghong, who later became vice president of China, which is really a brilliant politician. So they started to build up a faction, and they promoted several people from Shanghai to be Politburo members. As we know, that the Politburo, which consists of about 27 people, is a very, very powerful leadership body. Above or within that body is even inner circle called Politburo Standing Committee, which consists of somewhere between 5 to 9 people. Right now, they're just choosing 7 people for that standing committee, Politburo Standing Committee. Now, so Jiang Zemin and Zheng Qinghong, the president and vice president of China, brought several leaders from Shanghai and to serve as vice premier, and some of them actually even high position, like Wu Bangguo, who just retired from the head of the MPC, who actually was the number 2 leader next to Hu Jintao in the ranking of the Politburo Standing Committee, actually above Wen Jiabao. So that's the group. They also form a coalition with some other elites. Usually, particularly noticeable is the so-called Princeling group, and people like Bo Xilai, actually not Shanghai, member of Shanghai again, but also a Princeling. So they also form strong ties within that group.
Okay.
Now, in contrast, Do you want to be continued?
Oh yes, please continue. Then I'll ask a follow-up question after that.
Now, in contrast, that Hu Jintao also built up his faction centered around the Chinese Communist Youth League. Hu Jintao was in charge of that youth league in early 1980s. Now, you will see a lot of leaders in today's China, governors, provincial party secretaries, ministers, were youth league officials 30 years ago under the leadership of Hu Jintao when he was in charge of youth league. The most famous person is Li Keqiang, soon to be premier. Currently, he is the second highest ranking member in the Politburo Standing Committee. So you see this kind of 2 groups, Jiang Zemin's camp, Hu Jintao's camp, and the old Princeling versus Chinese Communist Youth League, and we call it Tuan Pai. This is the nickname to refer to that group. So they compete against each other for power, for influence, for policy initiative. But at the same time, they cooperate on certain issues, because bottom line is they wanted to Chinese Communist Party remain in power. So, but they also create the Chinese-style checks and balances, and that has been the case in the past 2 decades, when the strongmen like Mao or Deng were gone.
So it's 2012 now. How is it that someone who took power, or rose to power after 1989, took power in the early 90s, especially in 97 after Deng died, how is it possible that Jiang Zemin has so much influence over what's happening today?
Well, it's related with the nature of a collective leadership. You need to want to make sure that your proteges are well positioned. You can protect your interests or your family interests, at the same time to carry on your policy kind of preference or your ideology, or make sure that China or their faction in a well position. Now, so that's the incentive is very, very strong, and therefore it's not so much of Jiang Zemin has his power, but rather his faction has tremendous power. Then Jiang Zemin certainly is willing and eager to advance the interests of his faction, and for various reasons. So that's what we just witnessed in the past, a few weeks or months.
So, as of Thursday, when it was officially announced that Xi Jinping is chairman of the Communist Party, I mean, he's going to have an enormous influence on world affairs. I mean, what do we know about what Xi Jinping thinks about Japan? What do we know about what he thinks about China's relationship with America, and what parts of it he wants to keep, what parts of it he wants to change? I mean, how much of that information do we know?
Well, compared with American politicians, just went through, a lengthy campaign, so that we know far less than Chinese leaders, and they usually did not say much, and also particularly when they do not move to the top positions, they will not say too much, will not contrast what their predecessor, like Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabao said. Now, but based on our kind of observation that it's not completely in the dark that Xi Jinping visits a foreign country, talked to foreign leaders, had some foreign friends. We start to know about him, and but in a way, he is a contradiction. Based on the available information. On the one hand, he could be very tough, very nationalistic, and he remembered that he said in Mexico about 2 years ago that he criticized the United States that you should just shut up, should not point finger to China, use very strong language. And but at the same time, we also know that he is a leader, really. Could do business with United States, and also he likes a Hollywood movie, and his daughter is currently attending Harvard as a sophomore student. Now, this is all positive thing, and in many ways, I think ultimately that he is defending China's interests.
So how does, you mentioned a contradiction there. How does Xi Jinping square his position as leader of China and someone who defends Chinese interests and, kind of, one could say, put forth a China First type platform? How does he square that with having his daughter at Harvard? How do those fit together? Do we know?
Well, this is an interesting question, and different people have a different take, and maybe we overemphasize that aspect, and but the fact is that certainly that because of his view, his policy towards the United States, not just based on his own background or his personal experience, ultimately also based on the international environment and the Chinese nationalist sentiment, and also some of the things, events or development we cannot foresee. And but at least he is a person, we can do business. We refer to United States, and also his trip to United States last year was very, very successful. And China and the United States are two most important economies in today's world, and also geopolitically play a very, very important role. I think that the personal relationship and understanding and the mutual respect are all very, very important. So I think that nothing is inevitable, and there's a great opportunity for the United States to work out a good relationship with this new leader. Now, as regard to Japan, and not only just Xi Jinping, virtually all senior leaders, they are very much concerned about Japan-China relations. And usually under this kind of situation, all leaders will be very, very tough, because no leader can survive if they take that tough line. Now, that does not mean that they will take a confrontational policy, and usually it's not their interest to engage in war, despite the fact that someone argue that the Chinese leaders may distract the domestic tensions to a foreign conflict. I think Chinese leaders are usually smart enough to understand this is a dangerous game, because sometimes the xenophobic sentiment will quickly turn into anti-government sentiment. So they need to be careful. But sometimes it's beyond their control, because now there are so many players in China's foreign policy, interest groups and media, social media, military, and business group, and etc. And so they need to react to Chinese public opinion, accordingly. And that's the situation not only just in China, in United States as well. Now, it is interesting to point out that during the press conference of Xi Jinping, when he became the top leader, he said that start with the two major issues. That one is to deal with corruption. Secondly, is to improve the living standard to reduce the gap between rich and poor, the issues of economic disparity. Now, these two things are really based on survey, public opinion survey, because Chinese public thought these are the two most issues hope leadership should address. So he actually addressed them accordingly.
Do you believe that compared to Hu Jintao, who's in power from 2002 to 2012, that Xi Jinping will have to be more accountable to the people? I mean, I think it's very strange for a lot of Americans to think someone like Xi Jinping, who's not a democratically elected leader, still has to be accountable to the people he governs. I mean, what do you think his relationship is going to be to public opinion?
Well, China has changed, in a profound way, despite the Communist Party continue to be one-party state to monopolize power. But early on I mentioned about the intra-party tensions or checks and balances. But the most important is actually not within the party, but rather in society. Some more forces emerge, become increasingly important. For example, middle class. Despite the recent shrinking of the private sector, still expanding, and the legal professions become very, very dynamic, and they call for constitutionalism, judicial independence, and certainly they are already independent as lawyers, no longer in the state payroll. And also that the commercialized media, which was a very important development in the past 10 years. And the social media is entirely new. And within 18 months, Chinese Twitters, which called Weibo, increased from 0 to 300 million.
Wow.
And this number is only a couple of years ago. Probably now it's maybe 400 million or even 500 million. So this kind of development, but still in the beginning. Now, this completely changed the state-society relation. And really, you need to be responsive. Now, also interesting enough, a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, Xi Jinping also did a remarkable thing. He sent a text message to about 1 million local leaders.
Xi Jinping did?
Yes, at the Spring Festival. So itself, it's a reach out to this is the message, like a Happy New Year, and the hope that we will consolidate the grassroots, party to change China's Communist Party's image and whatever. So they use a new method to do this kind of outreach. In this case, it's outreach through grassroots leaders.
So I remember Bo Xilai also was very big on sending text messages, and would send so-called red text messages to millions of people. I mean, how do Chinese leaders like Xi Jinping, like I guess Bo Xilai failed, but like other high-level leaders, how do they walk the line between reaching out to people and reaching out to other officials while not appearing too populist and too much of a threat to their colleagues?
Well, actually, it's a little bit different between Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai. And for Bo Xilai, and he really did something quite dramatic. He is a princeling, but he all of a sudden sounds like he became a populist, represented the interests of people. And this is quite remarkable, in many ways dramatic. That's why some people said he is a political opportunist. And so for him, the election, he is not that afraid. Actually, he is not afraid of election in China, but he probably is more afraid of the election within the political establishment, because some other leaders are very nervous about this man. They will vote against him. It happened before. So, but on the other hand, most of the leaders actually are still uncomfortable with election, and with either within party or in general sense. So therefore, they are political conservative. And these seven members of the Standing Committee, which is the most powerful organization, leadership decision-making body, actually consists of leaders. They are economically competent, reform-minded, but politically more or less very, very conservative.
So I'd like to go back to China's relationship with America. And you're saying about them being economically reform-minded. In the American election, China as a currency manipulator was such a big deal. This idea that China is manipulating its exchange rate in order to take advantage of America, to take advantage of American businesses. And I'd like to ask you, how do you think this new leadership is going to deal with America in terms of trade? I mean, are they going to be more willing to allow more exchange rate flexibility, or are we going to see tougher trade policies towards America? How do you think the economic leadership, Li Keqiang, Wang Qishan, I guess Wang Qishan's not doing economic, but Zhang Lijiang, how do you think they're going to deal with that?
Well, it depends on specific issue. On the one hand, all of these leaders wanted to continue China's integration with the global economy, especially with the United States. And also, China has a dilemma because China certainly has a strong foreign reserve in the United States. But if they do not invest in the U.S., where should they invest? I mean, Eurozone or Japan? No. I mean, so there's some kind of limitations in terms of their choice. But at the same time, I think that they certainly interested in market reform in China or accelerate China's financial liberalization. This means that they will do more with the foreigners. The fact that they will be very, very slow or a little bit cautious in the political reform will make these leaders actually more aggressive in the economic reform, although ultimately economic reform requires fundamental political change. Now, but at least for the first, period or few years, or maybe at least a few months, they will emphasize on the economic changes. Certainly, that they are nervous with election. And but in terms of currency exchange rate, it's China's best interest to make it more liberal flow, and they also interested in enter U.S. market, and they also will give some investment opportunity, particularly if China wants to promote private sector, will give more loans for small and medium-sized private business. They certainly will also introduce more mechanism from foreign banks to change China's current banking system. Now, so there's a tremendous economic opportunity available in that area.
So in the last leadership from 2002 to 2012, Wen Jiabao, the premier, was seen as the most reform-minded, the one of the most popular touch. Would go down after natural disasters throughout China, would be photographed on the scene, kind of in the hugging people, kissing babies, method of politician. Is there anyone in the new standing committee who you think is most likely to have that kind of common touch and to be most outspoken about the need for political reform in China?
Sadly, not in my view, none of the current 7 members of standing committee have this kind of personality, and maybe Xi Jinping could do something similar, but it's not at the level like Wen Jiabao. This is something sometimes you cannot learn, or you learn now, it's too late. It's come naturally from leader like Wen Jiabao. Some Chinese criticize him as a Hollywood star. I disagree. I think that the fact that if you invite AIDS orphans to your residence, you spend your spring festival with coal miners, you visit the widow of Hu Yaobang, a reform leader who was purged before the 1989 Tiananmen. Since 1989 Tiananmen, every year he visits the widow of Hu Yaobang, the former party boss, purged early on. It's not a political show. Actually, it was a dangerous thing for him to do that. Now, his quick reaction with the earthquake, with many disasters, certainly comfort the Chinese public. Even the most recent train disaster, the July 23rd disaster in Wenzhou, eventually Wen Jiabao went there with his remarkable kind of 180-degree bow. I mean, apologize to the public, actually resolve the problem. But I think China will miss that kind of leader. We will miss Wen Jiabao, despite some of the cynicism, criticism, particularly in China. I think maybe that's a good thing, because China needs to more emphasize institutionalization, not individual leader like Wen Jiabao. But I still think that Wen Jiabao has done a lot during his tenure, and he may not be popular among some members of middle class, or certainly he is always criticized by the left-wing intellectuals. But many poor people, farmers, migrant workers, and also liberal intellectuals still like Wen Jiabao. And the New York Times piece criticized Wen Jiabao and his family. Actually, still, most liberal intellectuals thought that this is a very bad move. First of all, some of the evidence they use, the New York Times used, is really groundless and exaggerated. But most importantly, this be used by conservatives or by Bolsheviks followers to undermine the political reform agenda. And so I actually tend to agree with that assessment.
The piece you're referring to is a piece that reported that Wen Jiabao's family owns assets of $2.7 billion or more, right? That just kind of how the alleged corruption hurts his position.
That's right.
Dr. Li, you mentioned the personality or the lack of personality of the current leaders. Just two questions for you to follow up on that. One is, do any of the leaders have any discernible personality traits like we're so used to in Western leaders or leaders all around the world? I mean, do we know, what do we know about them that humanizes them? And also, if there is very little that makes them seem like, for lack of a better word, people as opposed to faceless bureaucrats, what strategy is behind that, behind not allowing oneself to show personality when being a leader in China?
Well, I let me first clarify that the current leaders may not have Wen Jiabao-like personality, but they do have their own personality. Wen Jiabao-like personality is that it's quite moving. Sometimes he will cry and along with the people. And Wen Jiabao also famous by his familiarity with the classic Chinese, and he can easily, cite the poetry and the classics and in a very profound intellectual way. So it's a good combination of the human touch, but also deep understanding of the classic Chinese and Chinese tradition. But in that regard, I think none of the current leaders have that kind of combination. Now, but at the same time, the current members of standing committee, they also have their own personality, and some of them are also quite strong, and and also should be respected for various things they have done. Particularly Wang Jisan has the nickname as the Fire Brigade, fighters, or head of the things. Whenever there's crisis, he will go there, whether it be SARS or whether it be financial crisis and etc. So that is a very good image, and also he's very tough to deal with some of the incompetent leaders, and very candid, very outspoken. Now, some other leaders also quite skillful and talented in their own ways. But the important thing is whether this kind of personality, individuality, or characteristic could be in a way to make that team more representative, more popular, and tend to unite it together at the time of crisis. These are things we do not know, and also can reach out to the different sector of Chinese society to receive support, but at the same time to make the party, make the leadership still coherent enough. Now that's the question mark, because the dominance of by princelings could be a serious problem, because public opinion is very critical about the dominance of princelings, and also some very, very powerful families not only control political power but also control economic wealth in various industries.
And I hate to ask you to predict into the future, but I mean, how do you think someone like Xi Jinping, who is a princeling and who Bloomberg did a piece on revealing that his family also controlled a lot of wealth, not as much as Wen Jiabao, but still that they were very wealthy. I think the number was somewhere in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, how do you think Xi Jinping is going to appeal to the common people and show them that he's not corrupt, that the system's not corrupt? I mean, how is he going to win the trust of the Chinese people? How do you think?
Well, first of all, I personally have reservation with both Bloomberg story about the Xi Jinping family and also with New York Times story with Wen Jiabao, and because even these two newspaper media, in their report, they never charged directly against Xi Jinping and against Wen Jiabao. There's no evidence whatsoever. And also, most of these activities, you can say all activities are under the law, are not a violation or illegal in a sense. But having said that, it is quite common that official corruption is widely spread, and there's a serious concern among the Chinese public. Now, for Xi Jinping, he does have a human touch in a way that he grew up in a family, was a senior leader, but when he was a teenager, and maybe even earlier, that his father was purged by Mao. And so that experience certainly taught him a lot of things. And later, when he was a teenager, in the 16 or 17, maybe 18, he was sent to the countryside, the remote area in Shanxi province in Yan'an, very, very primitive, backward, and worked as a farmer for several years. Now, that experience certainly taught him certain things like humility and endurance, adaptability, and etc. So that could really help him to have better understanding of the so-called real China, and has the way to communicate with people. Now, immediately after announcement of Xi Jinping as the General Secretary, the CCTV actually aired about that experience. They interview, the people who Xi Jinping worked with, this is 40-some years ago, during the Cultural Revolution, when he was a farmer or later became a grassroots party leader. So that is try to emphasize that aspect of Xi Jinping. But most importantly, Xi Jinping's personality and the character is really quite charming in its own way. And also he has an extremely popular wife, a singer, Peng Liyuan, could serve as a wonderful ambassador for many important causes like AIDS, like prevention, like tobacco control, and etc.
Actually, I just have one more question for you, and it's on the fourth-ranking member of the Standing Committee, Yu Zhengsheng. He in the 80s, his brother defected to the United States as one of the highest level known defections ever, and that hurt his career. And it just to me, it's such a fascinating story. How can someone whose brother defected, I think his brother was a colonel at the time, so a high level defection. How did he manage to climb so high after that happening to him?
Well, it's a fascinating story itself, but also beyond that, he really comes from a very complicated family. His uncle was a minister of defense of Taiwan and Kuomintang.
Oh, wow.
And his father actually married to Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and before, later Jiang Qing married to Mao. So, that kind of family background, and it's fascinating. But certainly what you point out is the most interesting thing. In the United States, you cannot imagine a cabinet member has this kind of background, even that. And there's a security clearance, etc. But it happened because partly he cultivated a very good relationship with Deng Xiaoping, and he worked with Deng Xiaoping's son in the 1980s, and during that defection happened that time. And also, this is also another way to tell you that he is a capable leader. Despite all these problems, he not only survived, but he continued to move up. It's really quite remarkable story itself. Now, you can say that he's very, very competent because this is the way he can climb so long and so to so high position is evident. But you can also say that there are a lot of liabilities against him, and so it would be interesting to see how he will act, he will perform. And recently at the 18th Party Congress, he said he and his wife, are very clean, and they are willing to, release their income and their family assets and etc.
Wow.
That itself is also quite interesting statement. Usually, senior leaders will not make such a statement.
That is fascinating. Well, Dr. Lee, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a
Thank you.
presentation of Worldwise. I'm Isaac Stonefish with Foreign Policy Magazine. It was Cheng Lee from the Brookings Institution. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.